beginning with a big thank you to Manuel and to Joana Flora and to Erika Vincent, because this was possible first through their long-term collaboration. Manuel Aalbers is a human geographer, sociologist, urban planner, and a full professor of geography at KU Leuven, the University of Leuven, Belgium, where he leads a research group on the intersection of real estate, finance, and states, with a grant from the European Research Council. Previously, he was at the University of Amsterdam and Columbia University, and has been a guest researcher at New York University, the City University of New York, IRS Climate Institute in Germany, the University of Milan
Bicocca,
and the University of Urbino, Italy. He has published on financialization, redlining, social and financial exclusion, neoliberalist mortgage markets, the privatization of social housing, neighborhood decline, gentrification, and the Anglo-American hegemony in academic research and writing. He is the author of Place, Exclusion, and Mortgage Markets in 2011, and the Financialization of Housing, a Political Economy Approach, Routledge, 2016, and the editor of Subprime Cities, the Political Economy of Mortgage Markets in 2012. He is also the associate editor of the Encyclopedia of Urban Studies in 2010, former editor-in-chief of the geography journal TESG, and has served as the guest editor for 10 different other journals. Yeah, so thank you to all and Manuel for this.
Thank you, Livia, for the introduction, also for inviting me, for Florin to take me around, and for Joks to work together, and Eniko, who isn't here, also to work together with the three of us to make the book that formed one of the inspirations for the exhibition. I'm very happy to be here. What I will present is not one research project. It's a combination of different research projects to tell a story. I use examples from different countries, Western world, Global South. I have one Romanian example I put in also. If it goes too fast, let me know. Sometimes I speak fast, and maybe some of the things I discuss are also maybe hard to comprehend. So let me know if that's the case, because if you're not understanding it, then it doesn't make sense for either of us to spend the time on it. So let me know if it's difficult to follow. So there's not a linear story in a way. I try to bring some linearity into the story by having an organizing principle, which I will explain later. But there's little pieces of information I give, and they will add up to something. But I don't start with the big theory and come up with examples, and then at the end I run out of time and don't have a conclusion. I take little pieces of different levels. I go between from the more concrete to the more abstract, back and forth. Also because I think it's often a better way to understand what's going on. Some people pick up better on some parts, other people on other things. So I try to mix it rather than having one part more theoretical and abstract and one part more real and concrete. I mix them. I will get back to this figure later. It's a good one to look at before I start, but I will come back to it in a few minutes. I start with these two figures. Does anyone know what these two companies do? What does Pirelli do? Tires.
General Motors. General Motors.
Yeah, what do they do?
Cars.
Yeah? What else do they do?
Calendars with naked women.
Calendars with naked women? Who is that? The calendars with naked? Pirelli, okay. What else do they do?
Oil extraction.
Oil, maybe a bit, yes. Pirelli is a real estate company that also sells tires. Most of the tires are made by someone else these days. General Motors is a financial conglomerate that also makes cars. Yeah, so this is how we think about how the economy is organized. We think that this is a company that makes tires, that's a company that makes cars, they make concrete things. But both of these companies over time have become different kind of companies. These are some of the examples here that you see to the left, some examples for Pirelli. Pirelli real estate franchising is a network of real estate agents in Italy organized by the Pirelli firm. At the bottom left, Livia mentioned Bicocca, which was the one I had to confirm the pronunciation, which is actually good because now we heard Bicocca twice. This is the Bicocca site in the city of Milan, to the north of the city. And what you see in the middle here is, I think it's called an incinerator. It's something they used in the factory where they used to make the tires of Pirelli, to the north of Milan. But you see now they've built an office building around it. So this photo for me, this building, is exemplary of what happened to Pirelli. From a company making things to a company being a service company in an office building. And the Bicocca site is, besides the offices of Pirelli and a mall and a theater and some other buildings, the main site of the Bicocca is a university. Italian universities sometimes are massive, the public ones. So in many Italian cities like Rome and Napoli, you have Rome 1, Rome 2, Rome 3, because basically they're separate universities within one. In Milan, they said we'll start a whole new university. So you have the University of Milan, known as Statale State University, and then the new one, also public, is Bicocca, built on the former Pirelli site. So where the tires used to be made, now it's the university, was a wasteland, a brown field, but Pirelli was able to sell the site to the city, who would then develop the new university. Then the city upgraded an existing train station. They extended the metro line and brought a tram line there. And they moved La Scala, the famous theater from Milan. They moved a second La Scala to this area, all with city money. And then Pirelli became one of the developers of the site also. So this, in a way, this site was where Pirelli reinvented itself from an industrial company to a real estate company. General Motors, I'll do a bit briefer. You already see the locals here, GM Financial, GMAC. GMAC was originally General Motors accountancy company. That became a separate company, so now it's no longer part of General Motors. But GMAC became one of the biggest subprime lenders in the years up to the financial crisis. So one of the biggest lenders giving loans to people who either shouldn't receive loans, or they gave loans to people who should receive loans, but they made them way too expensive. So that was originally part of General Motors. It became an independent company, but almost as soon as General Motors sold off GMAC, they started GM Financial as a new financial part of the company. The cars are just the other thing they do. Then in the crisis, General Motors had to be built out, GMAC had to be built out. So the Department of the Treasury, actually, and here we see the state coming in also. We saw the state here coming in through subsidies. Here we see the state coming in through a bailout. So General Motors was built out by the state, but also GMAC, the lender, was built out by the state. And some of the, I have to say it right, yeah. Part of the company became Ally, and then Ally was one of the funders, together with a company called Cerberus, to buy up a lot of the privatized social housing in Germany. The story is always told as if it's a Berlin story, it's a German-wide story. There's actually, relatively speaking, less housing privatized in Berlin than North Rhine-Westphalia in the west of Germany. But this happened through this former General Motors company that became independent, partly built up by the state, and then partnering together with Cerberus. Does any of you have heard of Cerberus before? Is one of the biggest private equity funds in the world. So private equity funds, what they do is, they find a company that they think is undervalued. They buy up the company, very often the entire company. They restructure the company and sell it again. Sometimes they chop it in pieces. Sometimes they take one piece and combine it with something else. But their idea is always, we invest for a couple of years, never a few months. It's not that super fast trading, but it's also not long term. It's for a couple of years. You restructure the company. Often you load it with debt, with loans, and then you resell it again. So Cerberus, at some point, was thinking, what we can do is we buy up this former social housing in Germany, and we restructure the companies, and then we bring it to the stock exchange. And this is exactly what they did. They brought it to the stock exchange. They bought up in Berlin one of the two largest social housing companies, GSW, 66,000 housing units in the Berlin area were privatized in one go, sold basically by the state to this combination of Cerberus and the former General Motors company. Also, Deutsche Bank was involved in the financing of this structure. And then this company is now known as Deutsche Wohnen. Some of you may have heard of it. You may have seen the campaign in Berlin, which is called Deutsche Wohnen and Co. Enteignen. How do you say it? What's the right English word? Not reappropriate, but you should.
You're saying socializing.
Socializing, yeah. Socializing the housing that was owned by these big funds and bringing them back, not necessarily to the state, but bringing them back in social hands in a way. Deutsche Wohnen in the meantime has merged with, Deutsche Wohnen was the second largest fund in Germany, the largest in Berlin. They have merged with the second largest fund in Berlin, which is the largest one in Germany. It is called Vonovia, which now owns the new combined funds, I think about 700,000 housing units. Most of them in Germany, a few in Austria, a few in Sweden, and they have a joint venture with the French company. It is, as far as I know, the largest landlord in the world. So you see the connections here between what starts as a car company, and then there's all these connections, and it brings us to the privatization of social housing in Germany. So what I try to show with this example is that how we think of the economy is no longer how the economy is organized. Even if we look at statistics, as I will do in a few minutes, about what's in the financial sector, what's in the real estate sector, it doesn't include Pirelli, because Pirelli is still industrial in most statistics. General Motors is still industrial in most statistics. But in fact, these companies are a real estate company and a finance company. So that's one thing. The other thing I try to show here is that finance and real estate are more and more mixed, and that the state has a role to play in all of this. The state has a role to play in making it possible for Pirelli to restructure their site and in a way restructure the company and for Pirelli to become a real estate developer, thanks to all the public investment, tram, metro, theater, all those things are public subsidies. And then on the General Motors side, it's the bailout of the company, it's the bailout of their former bank. And then on the same side, we see that then what they do with the money is buying up former social housing. So the state is everywhere involved. It's the regulator, it's the funder, it's the one who's making it possible, it's the one who's also losing something by selling something off, but the state is everywhere. So what I try to do with these circles is to show that there's different fields who look at these different things normally. So my background is more in urban studies. When I studied sociology, I specialized in urban sociology. When I studied urban planning, I specialized in housing. Now I teach geography, but I specialize in where the urban and the economic come together. So my tradition is more in the top right. Urban studies, and within urban studies you have people who critically assess real estate. And that's a mix of planners, geographers, sociologists, anthropologists, a handful of economists, but very few. And they traditionally have done a lot of studies on housing, on real estate, and they often look at the local state. Because the local state is very important for understanding how housing works, how real estate development works, gentrification, these kind of topics. On the other hand, you have political economists. Some of them are alternative economists, sometimes with a Marxist training, sometimes with the Keynesian training, but they're out of the mainstream of economics. Some of them are political scientists who study very much how politics and economics combine. Some of them are also sociologists, but there's always people who study the politics and the economics as if they belong together, not as separate spheres. Not as the politics being of the state and the economy being of the market, always how the two belong together. And they have studied finance a lot. And they often looked at the role of the state at the national level, also at the international level, but never at the local level. And they really didn't look much at housing and real estate. So I tried to bring together those true traditions, both of them interdisciplinary, even combining some of the same disciplines, but focusing the one much more national, international, the other one local, maybe regional. But they study different things, and they study the state in different ways, so I tried to bring those together. So I organized, you could say, not the project, but the larger research agenda I had around 7 propositions. And I have a whole range of examples that I can use for each of these propositions, so I made a selection here. First, I put more and more examples in, and then I took a lot of examples out. But just to have the right combination of examples for each audience. So I wanted to bring also one Romanian example in that we used in the book, but also examples that I've used before. So the first proposition is relatively simple. Real estate and finance have grown at the relative expense of other economic sectors. They are more important economic sectors now than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. It doesn't say anything about the relationship between real estate and finance. It says both of them become more important. And I illustrate this to two graphs, the top one for the US, the bottom one for the UK. The one for the UK is a bit smaller because it starts in 1970. The one for the US starts in 1947. One reason I take these two countries is because there's longer data sets. I think if you want to do this for Romania, it would be very difficult to have the long-term data set where the same thing would be measured over time in the same way. You could probably try to do something like that, but it would be harder for me to have those data, but maybe someone like Joks could do it, or maybe someone else in the room. So I'm not going to go through all the lines, but what you need to see here, see, I have this wire here. If we look at this one here, we see that the colors are a bit difficult to read, I think, on the screen. But basically what we see is there's this green line, real estate and construction together, and they go up from about 12% of the gross value added to the economy to around 17%. So that's a big increase, but it's also a long time. If we see finance and insurance, it also goes up. And then there's another line, it's missing here now, probably because the setting is a little bit different. It's the combination of the two. So if we look at the purple line, that's real estate and finance combined, and we see they basically go up from less than 15% of the economy to around 25%. So it's quite a big increase. Manufacturing goes down from around 25, first goes up to 28, then goes down to around, what is this, 12% of the economy. So a massive decrease in manufacturing, and a large part of that is made up by real estate and finance. Of course, if you would have something like IT, that would also go up, so it's not saying these are the only economic sectors. It's the same for the UK, you have a shorter period of time, but in a way, a faster development. You can see manufacturing coming from a slightly higher level, but going down to an even lower level, below 10. And then real estate, construction, and finance combined is the orange line, going up also a bit more in a shorter period of time. So this is just showing the sectors become more important over time. It doesn't show anything that why this is the case, how this is related to each other. And then what we see here is a similar picture, but in terms of employment. Again, US on top, UK at the bottom. You see manufacturing on the top, the red line, and the bottom, the dark blue line, is the line that goes down. It goes down almost the same way the lines go down here, maybe even a little steeper. So jobs in manufacturing disappear. This is not a surprise. And in the UK, again, this is a bit more dramatic than in the US. But then if we look at real estate and finance, we see that in the UK at the bottom, they barely create any new jobs. So a lot more money is being produced, value added, as economists would say, in the economy, as we saw here, because those lines all go up. But in terms of jobs, they barely go up. In the US, they go up a bit. You can see there's actually new jobs being created in real estate and finance if you combine them, the purple line, but still much less than how many jobs disappear from manufacturing. So we could say, in flat analysis, real estate and finance make up a much larger part of the economy. More money is being made there, but not so many new jobs are being added. So you could say for the economy, it doesn't matter necessarily if money is being made in one sector or the other sector. At large for the economy, it needs to be made somewhere. But in terms of jobs, real estate and finance are a poor substitute for manufacturing because they don't create the jobs, even though they create the money. So this shows something. But what it doesn't show yet is how real estate and finance are interdependent, how they are related. How real estate and finance is not just, oh, the one is growing, the other one too. The growth of the two is related, and there's, in other ways, relations between the two. This makes sense, historically speaking, because investment in real estate is expensive. If you want to put up just a house like this, it's an expensive investment. For a family, even for a relatively rich family, to put up one house is a big investment. For a lower middle class family, that's most likely the biggest investment they will ever make if they build their own house or if they buy their own house. So this is the same, is true if you build a factory. Even if you're very rich, if you build a factory, that's millions and millions to invest. So historically, there's always been a connection between real estate and finance because real estate is finance intensive, you could say. So what I'm going to do now in the next slide, I will give you a specific example of how real estate and finance are connected. I'm not going to try to tell the bigger story. I will try to tell the story through one particular thing, which is called a real estate investment trust. You see there the acronym on top. They're known as, you spell rights, but in English you say REITs. So a real estate investment trust is very simply a fund in which money is collected, and that money is used exclusively to invest in real estate. We hear a lot about funds like Aalbers, as I mentioned before. They get money, they invest it in all kinds of things. Aalbers was putting it in social housing in Germany, but they also are in pharmaceuticals, they're in the educational sector, they're in manufacturing, they're in everything. But real estate investment trusts, they sound maybe complicated, you've never heard of it, but they're relatively simple. Real estate is the only thing they invest in, the RE, and they're an investment trust, they're an investment fund. So the only thing they do is collect money from third parties and they put it in real estate. By law, they cannot do anything else. Typically, even one real estate fund will invest all their money in housing, another one will invest everything in offices, and a third one may put it in storage or in infrastructure. Even those are rarely mixed. It's very rare to find one fund that does housing and offices. Typically, they're completely specialized. So in that sense, they're relatively easy to understand. Many of them, you can just buy stocks on the stock exchange, which means that for us researchers, it's very easy to follow what they do, because if a company is on the stock exchange, they need to deposit information about how much the firm is worth, where they put their investments in, where literally they have built real estate, so it's a bit easier to follow them. But real estate investment trusts only exist if a country has introduced legislation to make them possible. Because these trusts, these funds, have tax advantages, because they only invest in real estate, often governments give them a tax benefit. So again, the role of the state is important. So this graph is for the US. In 1969, the US introduces federal regulations to have these trusts. This is an American invention. You will see in the next slide, they're now all over the world, but originally only in America. And you see the numbers here to the left. These are not hundreds or thousands, these are actual numbers. So they start from just over 10, maybe 11 or 12. The number goes up in the first few years, then it doubles in the mid-80s, it goes down a little bit again. You see the number of the funds doesn't increase so rapidly. Even by 2015, there's just around 40 funds. So it's not a massive market with many hundreds of funds. But then if we look at the line, the purple line, we see the market capitalization, meaning the combined value of all these funds, how much is that? And then you see in the beginning, at some point, the number of funds increases, but the market capitalization only goes up a little bit. But then if you see 2001, the number of funds is actually going down a little bit, probably because two funds merged. But the market capitalization goes up quite steeply. If you see it here, the line almost reaches the bottom at 2000. The number of funds goes down by 1 or 2, and the line starts going up steeply. And here we do see some new funds popping up, but the main growth is already when there's just a few funds. Then we see the crisis of 2007, the number of funds decreases, also the market capitalization decreases, but it decreases to the level of 2003, not to the level of 2000 or even older. So the decrease seems very, very high from here because it's almost halves the market capitalization, but in fact it only goes down a little bit. But then we see the real boom here in the number of funds. Again, this goes more or less to the level of 2005, a little bit higher, but you see the market capitalization by 2010, when most of Europe is still in the middle of the crisis, the market capitalization is back to 2006 levels, and then there's the real growth after that, and then it stabilizes a little bit. Yeah?
Can I ask something? Can
Yeah.
you explain market capitalization?
Market capitalization is, in this case, if they would all be on the stock exchange, it's the combined value if you want to buy all the stocks of all the firms. So how much the firms are worth according to financial markets. So this is not necessarily how much the housing is worth, although you think it's not only housing offices, how much the real estate is worth, but you would think if the real estate is worth more, then the funds are worth more. But of course that connection is not one-on-one. People might think the funds are worth more because they have growth potential, for instance. But you really see the explosion here, not so much in the number of funds, but in the amount of money that goes into them. Then this is a picture that's 10 years old. This was made by ING Bank, therefore the positive things for them are in orange, the negative things for them are not in orange. So these are countries around the world that have introduced this kind of legislation. And you can see, yes, it started in the US, 1969, or 1960, I was wrong, it's a bit earlier already. But you see, for instance, Australia, New Zealand quite early, also Brazil, looks 93, looks late, but if you start looking at Europe, most countries are actually much later. The Netherlands was actually 69, maybe that's why I thought 69, quite early. Belgium was relatively early, but you see Germany, France, around the same time of Bulgaria. Turkey is actually much earlier. So this is already outdated because in the meantime, a lot more countries are either introducing this or have introduced them. So most of the blue ones here already in the meantime have this legislation, and many more countries. And you see that yes, some of the global north countries are a bit earlier than global south, but then again, yeah, Brazil is already much earlier. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, many of them are earlier than some of the European countries or around the same time. But you see a whole wave here. East Asia, you see a wave between 2000 and 2005. A lot of countries within 5 years' time, just before the crisis, start introducing the legislation. If you look at Europe, some countries like Germany introduced it right in the middle. Also the UK is relatively late here. Many European countries have introduced it since 2010. So yeah, the picture is in that sense outdated, but it shows a little bit these funds are spreading. But again, those funds only exist if at the federal level or the national level the government says we want to have those funds, we introduce legislation to make it possible. Without those legislations, you can have different kind of funds, but not these funds. So this is another picture I did with a few colleagues, and it shows the two biggest countries for real estate investment funds, which are Germany and the US. It shows only the ones for housing in this case, before 10 years ago. So that is only imaginable, 1% unemployment rate. So Milan, forget about our picture of Italy being a bit disorganized and not doing very well economically. Milan is an economic powerhouse, richer than many northern and west European cities. Also quite well organized. People think like, it's probably also the city is not so well organized. I think there's few city governments who are as well organized in executing big projects as Milan. And you see there's many big projects. You would think a city of 1.4 million people has one, maybe two big projects at a time. Milan always has 3 or 4 at the same time. And I don't necessarily think they do the right projects, but according to their own terms, what they want to do, they execute it quite well. I think they could be more inclusive, they could include more social housing, they could do other things, but according to the plans they make, they are very successful in executing them, getting the money in, getting the investors in, getting the tenants in that they want for some of the offices. But then, I'm going to be focusing on this area here. So this is a different municipality, Sesto San Giovanni. Sesto San Giovanni is part of the red belt around Milan, which is around the north and the northeast, which is the former industrial belt around Milan. It's not so industrial anymore, as you can imagine. And here you see a few big projects in this municipality, less than 100,000 people, not very well organized. They don't have the big planning department that the city of Milan does. It's a quite rundown area. It's not a very attractive part of the metropolitan area, but the location is good. You're here, you have the ring road going through, you have a railroad, main railroad going through that splits afterwards. There's one airport there, the other airport is there. Around the ring road is not too far to the expo site. Third airport is here. So in terms of infrastructure, it's very well located, but it's a rundown area. So we're going to look at this white site here, which is the Falk site, which is a former iron producing site, steel and iron there. And I'm going to take you through the transformations of this site. So don't look at the whole thing yet. I'm going to go through it column by column or line by line. So until 1990, there is the Falk Corporation, which makes steel. In 1990, they closed the steel part. I don't know if they moved it abroad, what they did, because I wasn't interested in that part. But until the year 2000, they own the land. It's contaminated land, and yeah, it needs to have something happen to it, because as it is at that moment, it's not attractive at all. So there's something about the financial model of this company that we looked into, which I'm not going to discuss because it's really about the next phases where I will discuss those things. But yeah, they had high-end industrial activities, small-scale manufacturing. They didn't think of expected gains on the investment of the land because the land was there to have a factory. That was the meaning of the land was there to be able to produce something. The land itself was not seen as an asset. In the next phase, you will see that the land becomes an asset to make money through. So after 10 years of it being an empty site, steel factory closing in 1990, in the year 2000, they sell the land to a local real estate investor, Gruppo Passini, led by Mr. Passini. It's basically an individual firm of an individual rich person from Milan, but he organized it into a holding known as a Gruppo in Italian. And what he did is that he bought the land for 140 million euros, but he took a bank loan out of 200 million euros. Just imagine you want to buy a house for 140,000 euros, and you go to the bank and they give you a mortgage loan for 200,000 euros. So the loan is almost 1.5 times as large as what he wanted to buy. So that in itself is already quite interesting. If you want to buy the land, you can borrow that much more. In fact, he borrowed 250 million, 200 based on the collateral of the land, which was cheaper than actually the 200, and 50 million extra for future investments. So in a way, Gruppo Passini didn't need to have any money. They just needed to have the idea that they could do this, because they didn't need the 140 million. In fact, they got the 140 million plus another 110 million. So this is the large amount of money we're talking about here, purely based on this massive site. So they developed a plan how to redevelop the site. This many square meters, 734,000 square meters. There's floor area ratio here, what kind of activities. Expected profit rate 9%. This is all virtual. Gruppo Passini does not have the capacity to develop a site like this. The reason that they developed the plan is that once they developed the plan, they could go to someone else and say, this is the potential of this site. We can do a big, large scale development here, and it can be this big, you can make this much profit. Plus, they went to the municipality, so not the municipality of Milan, but Sesto, and said, this is what we want to do here. If you give planning permission, we can take away this eyesore and have a beautiful project that we develop here. They were not able to do that project, but if they got the rezoning, they could sell the land and then someone else might be able to do it. We know for sure that Gruppo Passini was never planning to do the development. We can't really demonstrate this black and white, but we know they didn't have the capacity. So in 2005, after 5 years, see everything here is in 10 or 5 years, also makes it easy, Gruppo Passini sells the land to Gruppo Sonnino Holding, which is really a holding company. There's different investors in there, mostly Italians, but not only from Milan. So you see an upscaling from Milan investor to a group of mostly Italian investors. And they paid for the land almost 300 million euros. So this bank loan that seemed ridiculously large compared to the price of the land actually wasn't that high, because Passini was right. The land was worth much more if you could do a big project there, only if you can get the zoning adjusted. So they pay almost 300 million for this empty plot of land. They actually pay down 88 million, so 88 million they have as investors. So this is large, rich investors if they have 88 million. The rest they borrowed, and they had a complicated borrowing, not just simply borrowing money from the bank. Actually, one of the banks participated with 25% of the investment in the project, rather than just loaning them money. So they became a partner in the project. Then they had spent so much money that they said, this project is too small. We need to do a bigger project. So they went for 1.1 million square meters, almost 1.5 times as large as the project that Passini had asked for. We're not sure if they were planning to do the redevelopment of the site. Maybe they were able to, because they also had this big bank involved. Some of the investors might have had the opportunity to do this, so we don't really know that for sure. The profits they thought they could get was 15%, so also this goes up a lot. And then, the crisis hits in the US in LA 2007, in Europe 2008, the sovereign debt crisis in Southern Europe 2009, 10, 11, and in 2010 they sell. So you think in 2010 is the worst moment in Southern Europe to sell anything. That is like the depth of the crisis in the Mediterranean countries. No, they sell the land for 405 million euros. So even at that moment, when the Italian economy is tanking, and generally the European economy is not doing so well, the price of the land still goes up. And the new investor puts in 60 million in cash. And again, there's direct participation of the banks in the financing of this, which means that the banks are not just lending money to the real estate developer, they're actually participating in the project, meaning that if the project makes a profit, the bank gets the profit rather than getting just the money back from the investors. If the project doesn't work well, they also lose money as the bank. And in this case, it's a new holding company called Bizzi and Partners, which is registered in Italy, but most of the investors in this case are international ones, but they invest through this holding company in Italy. The financial model becomes really complicated. I'm not going to explain that here, but just suffice to say, the financial model becomes very difficult to read. You need to have, in a way, the knowledge of finance, and you need to have the knowledge of law to really understand what they did. But it basically means that, yeah, the bank participates in other ways than just putting the money up. The project actually becomes a little bit smaller. By 2010, this becomes quite unrealistic. Also 15% profit becomes unrealistic, but 12 is still very high in that period of time. They also try to get public investment in the facility. They think if we want to pull this off, we need to have public investments. But then they have an option to make the project bigger again, up to 1.2 square million feet. So they start with this one. They get zoning permission for this. Also, this fails. Our paper ends after these investors are there. We write the paper 2014, 2015, gets published in 2016. And around that time, Bizzi and Partners sells again to new investors from the Middle East. And again, they go through a whole cycle. The land prices go up again, and still not much has been developed in the meantime. So what we see here is that the land itself gets such a value to be redeveloped that it's almost a thing in itself. You don't need to develop anything anymore. You would think like, the real estate is how you make the money. Here it shows, not necessarily. Just the potential of real estate development is enough to make money. So what we see here is in a way what we could call the financialization of the land, or we could even see the financialization of the land use planning. A detachment between the planning processes which take place at the local level and these financial and investor logics that go up at different scales. They start at the Milanese scale, then they go up to a national scale, an international scale, then international, but very specifically from the Middle East. But the logics of how these financiers and these investors think is very difficult from the local needs. The local needs, we're dealing with a municipality that is quite run down. There is some unemployment there, contrary to the city of Milan. It's a relatively uneducated population. It's a relatively poor population, and yet the project being planned there is completely at a different scale, at a different kind of consumers. And then what we see here is what Phil O'Neill, an Australian colleague, he calls the land an arterial route in the circulation of violence. So like your arteries are the main way to, in your body in a way, to pump things around. Not the pumping, that's the heart, but the way the air goes around. In a way, he says land has become this for finance. For finance, you need the land in a way to spread the money around. You can do it without the land, but this is the most efficient way to put a lot of money into investment quick. So some of you may know the work of David Harvey. David Harvey, a Marxist geographer, he argued in the late 70s and early 80s that real estate is something where money is flowing to when there's overinvestment in other parts of the economy. What do you do if the manufacturing goes too quick and too much money is being made? At some point you can't make more chairs or more other things, you have to invest it somewhere else, and that somewhere else, Harvey was saying, is real estate, it's land. And now I would think we're one step beyond what Harvey theorized. Actually, capital is not only flowing into and through the land, but land is being used as collateral, as security for something else. And that's what you saw the clearest here, where you buy something and you actually get a loan for much bigger. So the land being used as collateral means the land is the security. For the bank, the land is the security that if something goes wrong with the investor, they can always take the land. And the bank was thinking the land is also worth more than 140 million, otherwise they wouldn't get a loan for 200 million. So the land in itself is not even a place anymore to park the money, it's a way to create more debt and therefore to create in a way more money rather than it just being parked from somewhere else. And it also means that land is no longer a fix for overaccumulation somewhere else. What I mentioned, the investments, say, from manufacturing going into real estate. It is mobilized to create leverage, which is the amount of borrowed money compared to the amount of money you have. So leverage goes up if you borrow more money, to get more credit and to seek profitable investment elsewhere. Because what did these investors on the top do here? They put a little bit of money in, but in the first case, they borrowed more money than they even needed. And of course, that meant already here, before they had sold anything, they had 60 million extra here to invest somewhere else, another 50 million here, the difference between 200 and 250. So they had 110 million euros to invest somewhere else. And then they sold the land, and then they got another 300 million to invest somewhere else. So the land became crucial in making these investments somewhere else possible. So then we go to another proposition, proposition number 4, which is that real estate holds a special position within the contemporary financialized economy. And I go on now a little bit to the slide before this one, which goes a little bit more into the theory. David Harvey pops up again. The claim that I put down in a paper with my colleague and friend Rodrigo Fernandez in 2016 is that the absorption of capital by real estate is one of the defining characteristics of the contemporary economy, or what we call contemporary financialized capitalism. In other words, real estate is soaking up money. Often economists think of like, money has to go somewhere to be productive. We think of more, there is so much money around, where does all the money go? All the money needs to go somewhere. The problem is not that there's a lack of money, the problem is actually that there's too much money. The amount of money in the world increases faster than the number of people in the world. It increases faster than our life quality increases. So there's constant need for money to find profitable investment somewhere. And real estate is the key in this. Also, money goes into real estate, money goes into food, money goes in all kinds of things, but the key one that money goes into is real estate. So therefore we say real estate, the absorption of capital by real estate becomes one of the fundamental characteristics, not the only one, one of the defining characteristics of contemporary financialized capitalism, which is our name for the contemporary way of organizing capitalism. And not just ours, we built a whole tradition there, but the claim about real estate specifically in this financialized economy, that's more ours. So already in older literature, you see that real estate has a specific role in capitalism. In Keynesian economics, this is called solving or managing the capital absorption problem, because Keynesians also talk a lot about there actually being too much money, and the money always needing to go somewhere to find investment. David Harvey, that I mentioned 2 slides back, calls this finding a spatial fix for overaccumulation. So accumulation, to keep it simple, would be profits, extra profits being realized. If you create extra profits, you always need to do something with the profits. You want to invest them somewhere else where you can keep on making money. If you make chairs and you keep putting them in chairs, at some point the chairs will just become too cheap. So you have to put the money somewhere else, and David Harvey theorized, like half a century ago now almost, that goes into real estate and that creates a spatial fix. The spatial fix, because real estate is always located in a specific spot, so the money is fixed in space. But Harvey uses the word fix also for another reason. Fix has different meanings in English. It can be spatially fixed, like, you fix something to the ground, you put a nail in something, you fix something with a nail. But the fix in English, in popular English, is also what happens when you use drugs. You get your fix. So you can say, I use cocaine and I get my fix, or more innocently, I like dark chocolate, I get my chocolate fix. Right? That's another way to think of it. If you think of a particular food you like and you really need it, you get your fix. So David Harvey also uses on purpose in this way. He doesn't explain that so much in detail, but for English speakers, especially for American English speakers more than for British English speakers, it's very clear. That's the other meaning of fix. It's to get your fix, to get your high in a way. And this is the other thing. And of course he uses it on purpose because the high is nice at first, but if I eat too much dark chocolate, I get fat. If you use cocaine, it goes much worse. It's better to eat too much dark chocolate than to use too much cocaine, but it's still bad for you. And this is in the way what Harvey also argues. He argues that this is a short-term solution to get some pleasure, to get maybe some benefits, but then what are you going to do with all the money you make in real estate? You have to keep reinvesting all that money. So that this leads to new overaccumulation that you then have to find a new fix for. So this is being theorized before, and we build on that with that first claim. And then what we show is that the growth of real estate debt, in the main form is of mortgages, mortgage lending to buy houses, outpaces economic growth. One other way in which you see that is that house pricings outpace income growth. I'll show you a graph of the second one later, of the growth of real estate debt. I'll show you on the next slide. But I think for many of us, this we know. In most places that you know, whether it's in Romania or somewhere else, housing prices go up more than incomes, right? And this is true, I think, in 95, 98% of cities around the world. So what is unique is that the timing in Iași might be different than Bucharest, and in Bucharest might be different than in Brussels, where I live. But in all of these cities, the housing prices go up much more than the income. Sometimes they go down a little bit, and then they go up again. And those timings, how that exactly happens, are particularly to a country, particular to a city, but the broader trend is not particular to any country. Very often people say, what's very particular about my city, that the housing prices go up so much more than the income. That's everywhere. But the fact that it started in one country in 2013 and another one in 2008, those are the specifics of those countries or those cities that you need to understand through local knowledge. But if you want to understand the bigger picture, come on in. You need to also think about that bigger picture. So this is not my graph. This is a graph from some economists in the US, some of them working for the Federal Reserve, so basically the national bank, the central bank of the US. Paper from 2014, the data stopped in 2011. I'm not very good with big data sets, but I do more qualitative research myself, but I really like it if other people do the numbers well. So a lot of qualitative researchers are very skeptical of quantitative researchers and vice versa. I think both of them have great potential, but some people are better in one than the other one. So what's quite amazing here that they have a data set from 1870 to 2011, that they have the data set for 17 countries. So these are 17 OECD countries. So this is mostly Northern America, Western Europe. So Romania isn't in here, for instance. So the scope of countries is quite amazing, and the length especially of the data set is quite amazing. And they did something very easy. They made a graph for each of these countries. So in the paper you can find for each individual country a graph. But this is the combined one that I like to use. And it shows for both the blue and the red line what the ratio of bank lending is to GDP. So gross domestic product, which is basically what is produced in the economy in 1 year. So the size of the economy. So per year, how much is being borrowed or lent, depending from your viewpoint, compared to the size of the economy in that year. So always controlling for, so if the economy grows, you would expect this to grow along. And let's look at the blue line first. This is all forms of lending except lending on real estate. So this is lending to the butcher store or the bakery at the corner. This is lending to big corporations like the steel factory, like General Motors, like the big companies in Romania that exist, big corporations. This is lending on credit cards. This is lending on student loans. This is lending to governments, very important. That's a very big chunk of it. Corporate lending and government lending are the two big ones. Credit cards and student loans is all peanuts. Car loans, everything is in here except real estate. So the blue line goes up from less than 2% of the size of the economic production in those years to under 4 around the First World War. First World War means a little bit of volatility, a little bit of up and down, but not something very massive. Only here you see in the 1920s, the roaring 20s actually starts going down, and then up to the crisis of 1929, 1930 it goes up, and the line only starts really going down in the 1930s up to somewhere in the Second World War. The line starts to go up actually before the end of the Second World War. So yeah, it takes a long period, 1870 to 1920, 50 years for this line almost to double. So doubling is a lot, but in 50 years for an economic trend is not that dramatic. But it goes down a lot, and you see by the end of the Second World War, or just before the end, it's down to a somewhat lower level than where the graph starts. Then the line starts going up again, quite steep, but it takes until around 1970, 1980 before the line is back at the level of 1920. So again, more than half a century actually to make up for the decline. And then the line starts going up steeper in the 1980s, goes down a little bit and goes up again. And you know, this is not a massive development in 140 years if we see the whole graph. But then we look at the line for mortgage lending. It starts at less than 1% of the size of the economy, and you see the blue and the red go up almost the same. They even grow apart a little bit here, so the blue line going up steeper than the red line. Massive impact of the First World War, even though some of the countries here were not in the First World War. So it's quite interesting why this line doesn't decline and this one does. I don't have the explanation for that. Probably an economic historian could do a study on that. But the line goes up very steep from 1920 again, so 2 years after the First World War, before the line starts going up again. But it almost picks up here. You can see the trend line almost continues. And you see when the blue line starts going down from 1930 onwards, the red line first goes up a little bit, goes stable, and doesn't go down as much. So for a brief moment during the Second World War, there's actually more lending on real estate than all the other forms of lending combined. Which is quite interesting if you think that during wars, usually a lot of lending also goes to the military, goes to companies who make weapons, who make tanks and things like that. Which seems to be the case here. This stays up, but this doesn't. In the Second World War, completely different story. Then you see the lines start going up again. They even grow apart again a little bit. And up till about 1980, the red line follows the blue line as it did here. This is almost the same development here, 1870 to 1910, as 1950 to 1980. And then something starts to happen. From the early 80s onwards, this red line starts to go up much steeper. The blue line goes up steeper, but the red line goes up even steeper. And then before the turn of the century, there is more mortgage lending than all the other forms of lending combined. So this shows that for banks, lending on real estate is not just one of the many things they do, this is the key thing they do. It's already very important early on, as you can see here, because you could say if this is around 1 and this is around 2, it means together it's 3, so this is already 1/3 of lending. Real estate is key. Here it's even bigger, but by this moment, and you can see the line going on and on, you see this little thing here? Where it goes like, that's the crisis of 2007, 2009. That's the whole thing, that's the whole crisis. By 2010, 2011, before the graph ends, the line starts going up again, and we know that for the countries that there's data for individual countries, that the line is either stable or going up again. If we would look at countries that are not included here, so not Western Europe and Northern America, for most of those countries, this is where the growth of the red line really starts. If we look at many East European countries, it starts a little bit before 2007, especially in the countries with foreign exchange loans, then goes down a little bit and then goes up again. If we look at East Asia, the Middle East, and the richer countries in Latin America, this line, the red line, really starts going up after 2010. So this is not like, oh, the crisis stopped this, just like we saw before for the real estate investment funds. This is actually where it really starts to get off. So this shows, you could say, in terms of statistics, that we're not just talking something like, we research real estate and therefore we say real estate is more important. No, we can actually show that in terms of the finance of real estate, it's the thing that's the most important, everything else not so important. Or not at least as important. Combined, all the other sectors of the economy receive less funding, receive less lending than real estate. So, then a little bit again about the reasons behind this. So what we see here is, I'm going to go through a number of reasons, but I'm going to focus on the first reason, because if I go through all of them, it will become even longer. So one reason why this is happening, why we are blowing real estate bubbles, is something that an economic geographer from the UK, Gordon Clark, calls pension fund capitalism. And pension fund capitalism is, as the name suggests, about pension funds, but it's also about insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds. So together, those three are often known as institutional investors. So these are not the investors we often think about of Wall Street who take a high risk and things like that. But in fact, together, these three groups, these institutional investors, are by far the largest investors in the world. There's more money in pensions and insurance and in sovereign wealth funds than rich people have or than corporations have. This is where the real big money is. And a lot of this investment, most of it, but not all of it, is quite risk averse. Because if you run a pension fund, you want to make sure that people can retire. There's some scandals when it goes wrong, but most of their investments are relatively low risk. They sometimes do a little bit of high risk for a percentage of their investment, but the largest part, they usually don't want to take too much risk. So I'm going to show an example of Dutch pension funds. And of course, the Netherlands is a small country, but the third largest pension fund in the world is a Dutch pension fund. The Netherlands has one of the most extensive pension fund systems in the world, and it's what's known as a pre-funded system. So people who work, in a way, save for their own generation to retire. Whereas in some other countries, the people who currently work pay pension contributions for the people who are already retired. So if the current workers pay for the people who are now retiring, you don't need to invest the money. You just need to give the money to the people who are retired. But if your own generation saves money for when you retire, that is economically more sustainable, because if there's a graying of the population, you can keep it manageable because the workers pay for when they retire themselves. So my generation paying for when I retire, my parents who are retired were paying it when they were working. That is economically more sustainable, but it means that a lot of this investment needs to go somewhere. Because I've already been working for a long time, I will probably need to work for much longer, so all that money for decades needs to be invested somewhere. Which means that these funds, the number of money that goes into it increases. You don't need to look at the different colors. What I did here with a former PhD student, well, at that time he was a PhD student, we looked at how much these pension funds and other institutional investors in lands, how much money they have. So basically we see every 10 years, it's 82, 92, 2002, 2012, more or less the amount of money they have doubles. Of course the Dutch economy doesn't double every 10 years, right? It grows on average with a few percent per year. In the last 15 years, very little growth. But the amount of money to be invested doubles every 10 years, which is also one reason why there's always all this money showing for investment. So now I show a different part of the picture. I said earlier, Keynesian economists have always had this puzzle. What do we do with all this money? Where does it need to go to? This is why there is all this money. Because all this money is being saved up, and it's not going into economic growth. It's not going to directly in my income. I will benefit from it later when I retire, because I worked in the Netherlands for some years before I moved to Belgium. So some of this money, a tiny piece of it, would benefit me when I retire. But this amount doubles, and it goes into different things that are not so important here. But one important thing it goes into is real estate. So this graph, again, for each of the same periods, each of the same years, again 10 years in between, shows where the money is going. I'm not going to go through all the bars, but I want to look at that very tall one. That very tall one with the little dots inside it. If you like cycling like the Tour de France, this is almost like a polka dot jersey that the best climber gets in cycling. So this bar is money that the pension funds and the insurance companies, in this case the white bar is only the pension fund companies, that they invest indirectly in real estate, meaning they don't buy housing or offices themselves. They put it in these funds we talked about before. These real estate investment funds, these real estate investment trusts, they are one type of real estate investment funds, and they get the money. So why was this American fund able to buy up the social housing in Germany? Well, not just because of the Dutch pension funds, but because there's pension funds all around the world that put more and more money in real estate, not by buying it themselves, but by putting it in a fund that then buys it. So here we call that indirect real estate. They don't own the real estate. They put their money in a fund, which then buys the real estate. So you see, if we really look at that bar, it is tripling or quadrupling every 10 years. The total amount of money to be invested doubles every 10 years. The amount that goes indirectly into real estate in these kind of funds triples or quadruples every 10 years. In 82, it's almost invisible. By 2012, it is by far the largest of the different ways investments in real estate go. So again, this is the different part of the picture. First I show you what those funds do, how they grow. Now I show you where the money comes from. So these are some other reasons that real estate bubbles are being blown. The first one I discussed, this is a long-term trend, starts in the 1970s. There's a connection there to the oil crisis, the energy crisis, why this starts growing faster. But there's other reasons here that I won't discuss in detail, but they become shorter and shorter term. So one of them has to do with the policies of national banks like the European Central Bank after the crisis and during the crisis, policies of low interest rates that make real estate investments more attractive than other investments. I won't go on why exactly that's the case right now. Also nowadays, especially last year, inflation was very high, connected of course with Putin thinking that Ukraine belongs to him. That was the main reason inflation went up so much. And you would think, before inflation was low, and then investment in real estate was interesting because there's always a return on investment, even if inflation is low. But in high inflation times, real estate is also interesting because real estate is then less risky to invest in than other economic sectors. During high inflation, typically investments become more risky. but real estate is then, relatively speaking, less risky. So this is one of the things with real estate. If the development goes in one way, people say like, now real estate is a better investment. The development goes extremely the other way, and people say like, now real estate is a better investment. So whatever happens is not entirely true, but in many cases, the economy can develop in different directions, but always there's some reason why real estate is still interesting. The fourth reason that is not very widely discussed, it's at the bottom paper here, another one with Rodrigo Fernandez, is the capital market union of the EU. Earlier with some of the people here today in the workshop, I mentioned that the EU now has a housing commissioner, so the EU will now have housing policy. In fact, the EU has had housing policy for decades because it has financial policy that impacts on housing. So a decade ago, the European Union started to introduce the capital market union that was rolled out between 2015 and 2018, which basically meant capital markets in Europe between different countries, Romania, the Netherlands, Belgium, Slovenia, all those countries, the capital markets need to be more integrated so money can flow more easily. There's a lot of discourse around. They have great videos online. If we had more time, I could show you a video. I think it's Anna and Steve. And Anna and Steve are regular people, but they have a little bit of extra money. But one of them wants to use her money to invest, but she needs more money. That's Anna. And Steve has some more money. He doesn't know what to do with it, but he thinks if I can bring it to someone who can do good things with it, then I invest. And they say, thanks to the capital market union, regular people like Steve, who has a little bit too much money, and Anna, who has some money but not enough to invest, can find each other and they can have great investments, and the European Union will prosper across countries because Anna and Steve are in different countries. In fact, most of the capital market union has nothing to do with small-scale investors. It has everything to do with big corporations, big banks, and big funds. There's very little in it for the common man and the common woman. And one thing the capital market union did is that it pushes securitization, which is the repackaging of loans and selling them in financial markets. So one of the roots of the crisis in 2007 in the US was that all these mortgage loans were being resold to investors who then didn't often know what they were buying. Sometimes they were buying crap, sometimes not. And that brought, in a way, the economic system down. The European Union has been pushing this. Not very successfully. A lot of Central and East European countries who don't do mortgage securitization still haven't introduced it. Because yes, the European Union can roll out the legislation, but individual countries also need to implement legislation to make these things possible at the national level. So some of this has not been that successful. The European Union has been pushing it quite hard. So that's something that's rarely being discussed, but we think that's a fourth reason that's also important. But what these things do together is that they create a global pool of liquidity. Liquidity meaning money that you can easily move around. If you buy this house, you cannot move the money around anymore. You have invested it here, so it's going to be difficult. But if you put your money in a fund that buys housing, then you can take your money out of the fund. And then you can put it somewhere else. You can put it in a different fund, you can put it in a different industry. So there's a large pool in the world of money that's always looking for investments, but it's looking for safe havens. Especially during the crisis and the years after, a lot of investors said like, maybe I don't need to make a profit of 15% because that's quite risky. I'm quite happy with 5%. So we often think also, these funds make mega profits. A lot of these real estate funds make profits 5, 6, 7%. The ones that take a higher risk, maybe 8 or 9. But the ones who invest in housing, I don't think any of them make more than 8% return on investment. So 5% return on investment seems quite moderate, right? But you compare it to putting your money in a savings account, how much do you get? 1.5%, 2% now. 3 years ago, you get 0% or 0.5%. So 5% return on investment is a lot if the alternative is very low. And the alternative for many pension funds is not putting it into savings, but putting it into government bonds. If you put it into government bonds before COVID crisis and before Ukraine, if you put it in one from, say, a northern or a western European country that were considered the safest, you get 0.0%. In some cases, in a brief period of time, you had to pay to give your money to the government. You would actually have to pay for the government to store your money in a way. If you would put it in some Central and East European countries, you would get a little bit more return on investment, but the risk was considered a little bit higher, but it would still be less than that 5% you could make on housing. So if you put it in these German funds that invest in former social housing, they would always rent out the housing. They would always be able to rent out that housing. There was very little trouble. So for investors, that was seen as low risk, almost as low risk as putting their money in government bonds. But yet a return of investment of 5% rather than 0% or 1 or 2%. So that money goes into real estate because it's considered safe, even though it's usually, most of it is not a high return on investment. In real estate development itself, there's often higher returns on investment because there's higher risk involved. If you develop a mall, like we see many of them around here, the return on investment is on average a bit higher, but sometimes some projects really do poorly and you lose money. So to compensate for the projects where you lose money, you want to make more money on the other ones, right? You take more risk, so you want to have a higher return on investment. But a lot of that money goes in lower risk investments. And it goes to buying up mortgages, it goes to giving out mortgages, it goes to developers, it goes to individuals who get mortgage loans. So the money can go into real estate in many ways. So I've now told it with examples from different parts of the world, but still often suggesting that this is more or less the same everywhere. And I could say, well, many things are more or less the same everywhere, but they're not exactly the same everywhere. Just I was just saying, the government bonds in Romania would get you a slightly higher return on investment than, say, the Netherlands, because the risk is considered a little bit higher, so you need to have more return, so there's already a bit of a difference there. But, so countries follow different pathways, but those different pathways are not always radically different. So I mentioned before house prices and income growing apart. This is a graph from a former PhD student in one of the Brussels universities, Alice Roman-Vielens. She made a very simple graph. I love it because it's so simple, and also it looks very old-fashioned in the layout. So I really like it for that idea that it's super basic. So she used index numbers, so everything starts with 100, and you see an almost flat line. That's the income in Brussels. That would probably look slightly better in many other cities, but in Brussels you see the income is more or less flat in a period of, 18 years. In 18 years' time, there's almost no income growth. So this is actually not a best case scenario. But you see the housing prices for a while, they stay more or less the same. And then they, in a short period of time, 2002 to 2005, 2006, they start going up very steeply, then they stabilize again. And the last years they've been going up again. But basically what we see that in a period of 3-4 years, the housing prices double and income levels remain the same. My claim is that this happens all around the world. They don't double everywhere. In some places they triple, in other places they go up 1.5. In some countries it's not between 2002 and 2006, but it's between 2010 and 2015. In another one it's between other years. But the general trend we see everywhere, but as I said before, the timing and the exact statistics are different everywhere. But we could change the graph a little bit. It could still look more or less the same, but we change the years a little bit, change the numbers a little bit, and it would be Iași. We change it again a little bit, and it would be Bucharest. But the picture would be the same. In many other cities, this is falling. So in many other cities, the bottom line would go up a little bit more, or it would go down and then go back up. But the other one always goes up more, right? You know that from your own experience. The housing prices always go up more. Rents are a bit more complicated. Firstly, because we have less good data on rents, because a lot of rental prices are not registered. Also because in some countries, the rents actually don't go up as much as the housing prices. If you start looking at the rents, there's a lot of talk about the rents going up, but not everywhere do the rents go up as fast as the housing prices. They typically go up faster than income levels, but the difference is smaller in many countries. But then again, the data are less reliable, so it's hard to say. So this is something from Colin Hay, a political scientist from the UK. And he says we're often talking about divergence and convergence. And divergence suggests that two countries grow apart. If we could compare Belgium and Romania, we would say, they become more different over time if they converge. If they diverge. If they diverge, you grow apart. And converging is they become more similar over time. So you could say if, let's say, the housing prices in Romania rise more than in Belgium, maybe they become more similar over time. They won't become the same, but they become closer to each other. Or if mortgages grow very fast in Romania, they will become closer to the level they have in Belgium. They converge. Or something else happens in Belgium actually, they grow much more and they're already higher and then they diverge. So he's saying this is all nice and well, but this discussion about convergence and divergence sometimes blurs what we're actually talking about, because he said there's not 2 scenarios, there's 4 scenarios. I won't discuss all of them. I think the interesting one here is scenario number 2, which I think is happening in many cases real estate and finance. In this case, you could say the 2 lines might be 2 countries or 2 cities. In this case, over time, they both go down, but they grow apart. So Colin Hay says in the discussions, this would be called divergence, and we say the countries become more different over time. Yet, what we see here, both countries undergo the same trend. So this is what he calls a common trajectory. The countries undergo the same trend, in this case one of decline, and they become more different over time. And he said this is very different from how people usually understand divergence, because people understand usually divergence as scenario number 4. 2 countries grow apart, with lines going in different directions. But actually in scenario number 2, the lines go in the same direction. So what I'm thinking often happens in cases of real estate and finance, 2 lines going up, but they might actually, the difference might become bigger over time, and they're undergoing the same trends. And on the macro level, we might call the trend neoliberalism, we might call it financialization, and on the lower level, we might say housing prices, mortgage loans. And you would see that in some cases, there's still countries growing apart that are already different, but they undergo the same trend. Mortgage markets on the longer term have been growing almost everywhere, but it doesn't mean that, say, Romania is now more similar to the Netherlands. The Netherlands had such an explosion in mortgage markets from already a high level that they grow further apart from Romania, even though both Romania and the Netherlands might be undergoing the same trend. So when I speak of a common trajectory, I'm not saying countries become more similar over time. They may actually become more different over time, but they have similar trends they undergo. Does that make sense? Then I can drink some water while you think about it. Where's this? You can see it if you look at the bottom very easily. So this is my Romanian example. This is where we were yesterday, the building of the Mall Moldova, and we see prime capital there. I got interested in prime capital when I was reading the other chapters of the book, actually earlier when I was hearing the presentations of the other colleagues working on all these Romanian secondary and tertiary cities. Often prime capital came back. They were investing in mall development anywhere in Romania, and I wanted to know who is prime capital and where does the money come from. So my own chapter in the book, I did the introduction together with Joks and Enico. They did most of the introductory work, I did a little bit. But then I did my own chapter, which is basically about what was earlier called pension fund capitalism, all this money of pension funds, institutional investors, coming down into real estate. So I wanted to see, do we see the same in Romania? So I started to search. On the day that I heard the presentations, the next day I had to say something myself, so I just took a screenshot of what I found that day a few years ago. And it was relatively, I think it was late 2022 when we had the presentations, and you can see the articles from September 1st, 2022. So I think 1 or 2 months before we had our online meeting. And Prime Capital and MAS plan to invest almost 2 billion in Romania's real estate market by 2029, okay? And it says a little bit who they are. And you start searching, and every time you find Prime Capital, you find MAS. If you find MAS, you find Prime Capital. So I started to wonder, is MAS the same as Prime Capital? The short answer is no. The longer answer is they kind of are. It's not very much longer, but here you see the developments. Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Romania, Bulgaria, Romania, Romania. There's more projects, and most of them are Romania. They have 1 or 2 in Bulgaria. I think they have 1 or 2 in Poland, and the rest is basically Romania. So I started to look at where the money comes from, and then you look at Prime. The main investor in MAS is Prime. So Prime is the biggest shareholder in MAS, but then also the other way around. There's also some co-shareholding. So it's very complicated. I will spare you the details. But what I basically try to track is where that money comes from. And then if you look here at Prime, you would find again some of the same investors that you find here as well. And it turned out there's no Dutch pension funds, no Canadian, no American ones, no German ones. South Africa, exactly. The main investor here, besides them investing in each other, is a South African pension fund. So yes, it's still pension fund capitalism, but it's not exactly West European or Western capitalist pension funds. It's actually Global South, but one of the richer countries in the global south, kind of. Pension fund investing there. Jux and I were talking about it earlier. Behind the company, there's two people. They met each other earlier when they worked together in the same fund, and then they probably saw an opportunity to set it up in such a way to have a local development arm, completely Romanian, and to have the funding arm that's mostly Romanian, but not entirely, and that gets money from the South African pension fund, but also from an American hedge fund. So that's a much smaller investor overall, because the pension fund comes in different ways besides the 8.6%. So yes, the pension fund capitalism is not something that we just see in the Western world, we see it in Romania too. And all these mall developments where you see prime or mass, that means that it's basically being funded partially by South African pensioners, or actually South African workers, and the money will go to pensioners. So we looked at the structure of these companies. Mass and prime together have what they call a development joint venture structure, where you can see the different interests. I'm not going to discuss again the details, just to show like how these companies are really integrated. It's the money that's going from one to the other one, but the one does the development, the other one gets the money in. So this is in a way the real estate and the finance coming together in two different companies, but those companies almost merge. They're almost the same company. And then this is from a circular that they give out to investors from us. So I'll just give you half a minute to read how they think this part of Europe is where they should invest. Yeah, so the basic story, forget about Western Europe, it's not interesting anymore. Central and Eastern Europe is where the money is at. This is where we can make the money, this is where we can develop malls basically, mixed-use developments, but malls are the main thing. And then if you look at their investments, you see, there's something in the UK, there's something in Germany, but actually green and black means things they want to get rid of. So the investments are already quite few here in the UK and Germany. This is just from their own webpage, from a report that I found there. It's not like any secret information, it's just out there. And you see they want to divest from two of the main West European markets. And as I said before, Poland, one project, Bulgaria, two, and then Romania, a few dozen projects. So it's really not a Central and East European firm, it's a Romanian firm, funded partially through South African pension fund, partially funded through an American hedge fund, but the money is primarily going into Romania. The focus is on Bucharest. I think they were rolling out another project in Poland in the meantime, so maybe they're going to expand a little bit more in other Central and East European countries, but the focus is mainly on Romania.
More in Romania, in the center.
Yes.
More,
Yes.
Also half owned by also South African firm.
The other one's all, yeah. So you see against South Africa. They're fighting over investments in Romania. Even in Iași and two different malls, they're competing in that sense, yeah. So you see here, then the other interesting things are here are the red dots. Of course, there's a Bucharest office because Bucharest is the economic capital of Romania. They have most of their investments here. You need an office in Poland and Bulgaria, probably to run the local projects there. But then we see the Isle of Man. That is not because they have two projects in the UK they want to get rid of, it's because the Isle of Man is a tax haven. At the bottom you see Malta. So the other thing, very easy to look up, is where they have all their subsidiaries of the company registered. So the British Virgin Islands, they don't show up on the map, but we can find it in the registration. Their head office is in the Isle of Man, but the company is also listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which again shows how they're trying to bring in South African capital, but also with a joint listing at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. Not Romania, not London or Frankfurt as main stock exchanges, but Luxembourg, which again, of course, is a tax haven. The company is primarily run by Romanians, but they have 57 subsidiaries and 42 are registered in known tax havens. So Malta, Isle of Man in this case, Luxembourg, and the other offices are, the other subsidiaries are mostly in the countries where they invest in. So most of their subsidiaries are in places to avoid taxes, basically. So that was the Romanian illustration to also show that there's these countries following different pathways, but also, yes, in a way, it is a version of pension fund capitalism, but it's a different version of it. It's the Romanian version, the Romanian South African version, you could say. So we get to the last two statements, which I will discuss together through an example of Brazil. In a way, I've already explained the 6 through many examples. States have enabled and furthered the growth of real estate, of finance, and of their interdependence. I showed that through the first example of General Motors, the example of Pirelli factory. I showed it to many of the other examples. The next example will again show that as well. And that's the last example I will discuss. And it also shows a little bit more, not just at the national level, but at the urban scale. You could say some of the earlier examples did that as well, but I often went also, to the national scale. So I take here on purpose an example from the Global South, from Brazil. I've worked a lot with Brazilian researchers. And in our field, people always say like, but everything is different in the Global South. Financialization, no, is very different there. They don't really have it. They don't have complex financial markets. If you look up where most work is being published, academically speaking, on this kind of things, financialization of the city, financialization of housing, of real estate, number 1, Brazil. Number 2, China. Number 3, I'm not so sure. But it's really Brazil, China, and then there's a long time nothing, and then there's maybe some European country, not the US. This kind of perspective is not very popular in the US. A little bit is not the biggest thing. There's more popular in Canada, and now in Romania, thanks to the book, thanks to a few other studies with the network around Enigo Vinci. But Brazil is actually where most of this work is being done. So Brazilian colleagues are very interested also in the kind of work we do in Europe and elsewhere, because there's this cross-pollination, you could say. So the example I discussed from Brazil is known something in Portuguese as the operações urbanas, which simply means urban operations. I think especially for you speaking a Romance language, a lot of Portuguese words are hard to pronounce, but are easy to read. But even from English, this is quite easy. Urban operation. The urban operation is not the name of a big project. It is the name of a policy framework. The policy framework is called the urban operation. It's a federal policy that Brazil introduced at the request of the largest cities. In practice, the projects that are being developed under this policy scheme are called urban operations as well. So that makes it a bit complicated in the literature, but it's originally a policy framework called the urban operation. So I use the literal translation to keep, in a way, the name of the policy framework in mind. And there's a lot of work on these urban operations by Brazilian scholars. I did this paper together with 2 Brazilian scholars. One of them was a former PhD student of mine, Mayra Moschiaro. The second one is a Brazilian law scholar, and he's called Pereira. And he worked in his PhD in a way on almost like a critical law perspective on real estate development. Super interesting. Álvaro Pereira. So he spent also some time in Leuven as a guest, so we started to think about how to bring our different interests together, and we developed this. It says still here forthcoming, but this is a few years ago that the book came out. But we focus on one particular element in these urban operations, which is a financial product which is enabled by this policy. You see the name here in Portuguese. I won't try to pronounce it after I already did the urban operations in Portuguese. But again, you can probably, from Romanian, you can probably understand completely what it says there in Portuguese. So I put it in English, certificate for additional building rights, literally the potential for the addition of construction. So what does it allow? It allows you, if you buy this product, you have to buy it from the government, not the federal or the local government. You buy a financial product, and this financial product allows you to construct more real estate than the current zoning allows. I will illustrate it with a little drawing on the next picture. And why is it called a financial product? Because if I buy it, I buy these rights, I can resell it to someone else. So you don't need to be a developer to buy them. Like there's other kinds of additional building rights that are very popular in the US. It's inspired by the US example, but it goes one step further because they can be resold. In the US, in places like New York, Chicago, you could pay the government in some cases extra money to develop more. That's a common framework in place there, which brings money into the government. So the government is happy, and the developers are happy because they can develop more. So let's say they pay another 10 million, but they make another 12 million profit. That's 2 million gains for the developer, and for the government, that's 10 million dollars in this case for free. The Brazilian case is different because you can really resell these rights. In the US, it's not possible. It's one deal between one developer and one local government. In Brazil, they say we have so many of these rights available, which each of the rights you can do so many extra square meters. You can use them within the perimeter of this urban projects, which they then call urban operation as well, confusingly. But if I buy them, I can resell them. So you don't need to be a developer to buy them. You can be an investor and buy them and then sell them to a developer, for instance. Or we can just sell them, between each other. And they can go up in value, they can go down because it's a financial product. It's not a negotiation in this case.
Sorry. Is this story quite similar to what you explained earlier about FLAC in Milan?
No, because that's purely the land that's being resold. Here it's only the right to build more on the land than the zoning allows. So let's say the zoning allows you to build 10,000 square meters. If you buy the financial product, you might do another 2,000 square meters. But if you buy it and you don't want to develop it and I want to develop it, I could buy it from you. And maybe you paid 1 million for it, I pay you 1.2 million. You didn't need to do anything but just hold it for a while, you make profit. I make the profit because I think it's not worth 1.2 million but 1.5. And the government makes a profit because it gets the money up front. And the way why Brazil came up with it, because you can imagine in the Brazilian context, it's much harder to get the taxes in for the government. So it's one way to get money into the government before they can even put the taxes out. So they've used systems like this in the past. Brazil has been quite innovative in this way, but now this is a new innovation because it was never a financial product. So this is similar to something they have also in the US called tax increment financing. The UK does it too. Maybe there's Central and East European countries that do it as well, I'm not sure, but it's really big in the US and it's not as big in many other countries. Because what makes this unique is that the other things are purely taxed, this is purely a financial product. So originally they were designed for only the largest redevelopment projects in Sao Paulo and in Rio de Janeiro. And the largest redevelopment project in Rio de Janeiro is the Old Port area, and it's a larger redevelopment project than I found anywhere else. I asked Chinese colleagues, what's your biggest project? None of them were as big as the redevelopment of the port in Rio. In Sao Paulo, there's 3 big projects that together might be larger, but the one in Rio is the largest redevelopment project in the entire world. And then you can use these financial products within there. In the second round, there's new ones in Curitiba, so in a secondary Brazilian city, still a mega city. There's also new ones in Sao Paulo, and there's new ones in Rio de Janeiro metropolitan area. So not the municipality only of Rio de Janeiro anymore. For those of you who know Brazil a little bit, Niterói is one of the other cities. I think still 3 million people, but it's just basically a suburb of Rio de Janeiro. You also have them now. So here might become a little bit easy to understand how it works. So what happens? The state issues a financial product, which is called the CPAC, they say in Brazil. They sell that, for instance, to a developer, but it could be anyone else. The developer is allowed to build, in this case, 3 extra floors on top of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the zoning allows them to build this. Buying the financial product gives them the right to do this additional potential, to use the words literally translated from the CPAC. It means that the government gets money up front before the development is finished, because if you want to do this larger development, you need to buy this before you start developing. So it means that the government directly has money, which they can then invest, and they typically put it into infrastructure in the same area. So it's a very smart idea, actually, for the government to get extra money in without having to tax extra, which would piss off the big companies. They won't need to tax the middle class either. They can't really tax the poor because it's mostly informal economy. So it's a very efficient way to get extra money in. So there's a little bit more details. Most of this I already said. Some of the things I think we skip because I'm already talking for a long time. But I'll show you what happened from an earlier period. So what I discussed now is basically the right thing. It started in the 1990s, was really rolled out in the 2000s. But in the 1970s, they already had a similar system. It was not a financial product, but they already had these additional building rights. It was like they had it in the US, a negotiation between one developer and one local government. But what happened in the past is like, if you did these extra red floors, you would have to pay money to the government to develop more, but that money went into a city fund. This is a picture of Rio de Janeiro, and you would have the development here in the downtown area, and then the city invested this money somewhere else. So it was a redistribution. In effect, it was a real estate-based welfare policy. It was very difficult, again, for Brazil to get the taxes in to build up a welfare state. So what they did instead, they gave real estate developers the opportunity, no obligation, but the opportunity to make extra money if they would give extra money to the city fund. And then the city fund used it to also invest in the favelas, in the informal neighborhoods. So a lot of sanitation in the 1970s was built through real estate development in the center. It's quite, I think, if you have a capitalist system, which we do, this is quite a good way of actually using capitalism to redistribute the money. Not by taxing, but in this way, by a voluntary contribution. If you give us the money, you can do more. You don't need to give us the money. You can just do this building. If you want to do this building, it's fine. If you want to do the red one as well, you just pay us money, and we move the money somewhere else where the money is more needed. And everyone was happy. The government was happy, the developers were happy, the people in the informal neighborhoods were happy. What changed when they made it into a financial product, that the money went not to a city fund, but into an urban projects fund, and the money had to go back into the site. So it could be a park, or it could be infrastructure. And what I can show you, I'll skip this one, is in Rio de Janeiro. This is what the port area used to look like. In the top right, you see one of the informal neighborhoods. This favela was originally known as favela. This is the first favela, not in terms of when it was constructed, but this favela named all the other favelas in Brazil. So it's also known as Morro da Providandia, but this is now how it's known, because if you just call it favela, it would be confusing. You see it's a rundown area. That's a massive, massive site. And what they did is they put tram lines in, they put cable cars in. So in a way, they put a lot into public transportation. So not the worst investments to put back into that area. They didn't put so much into car infrastructure. They put a little bit into also the existing favela. As a result, some people have been displaced from the favela. Other people now live in the favela with better public transport and better sanitation. So it's a very mixed picture for the favela. It's becoming a little bit of a tourist site almost. And apparently you have Airbnbs even now in the favela. Yeah, here's some more pictures. What they do, you know, they build these kind of office buildings. Santiago Calatrava built some buildings there. I think Zaha Hadid did some buildings there. They were going to do a Trump Tower. Then they paid off Trump because when Trump got elected, they didn't want the Trump Tower anymore. So they had to pay Trump not to use his name. So he still made money in the end. Then Sao Paulo, I don't know, has any one of you been to Sao Paulo? Sao Paulo is the car capital of the world. They have highways that are wider than in Texas. And you can see here where they put the money in is bridges for highways and extension of highways. This is like a typical scene in Sao Paulo. Highway with here 3 lanes, another 4 lanes next to it. This is just one direction and the other side of the highway with lanes on the other side. There's one highway that is basically around 20 lanes, 10 in each direction. And then they build these buildings, fewer star architects, more banal architecture. I'm not sure if that's worse, because the star architecture doesn't necessarily make it great either. But it's in a way, it's even more flattened version of the investment. There's no pretension that there's public transport that's going to benefit people. It's cars and it's glass office towers, glass and mirror office towers. Then we get to the conclusions. I didn't use the term financialization that much because I thought then I have to discuss financialization at large, but you can see how finance plays a role in many of these things. It's a key trend throughout economies. It happens at different scales. It's not just a North American or European or Northwest European phenomenon. We see it around the globe. We see it in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, but we also see it in South Africa. We see it in Brazil. That doesn't mean that everything is the same. There's geographical variegation, but we also see common trajectories. Again, not suggesting that things become the same over time. Through the common trajectories, things may actually become more different, and yet we see the same trends in many countries. So one of these things, all this money being invested, is sometimes called a wall of money. It's a metaphor we took from the investment market. And this money goes into something that in the investors call high quality collateral. High quality collateral basically means low risk investments. There's only a few things that investors consider low risk. Government bonds is the main thing. Stocks in some companies, often companies that exist for a long time, that are relatively resilient in times of crisis, that only stocks go down a little bit. And the third thing is real estate. So before the COVID pandemic, government in Western countries were not spending a lot more money, so there was not the opportunity to put more money for investors in government bonds. During COVID there was, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was more government bonds, but before the COVID pandemic, there wasn't a lot of government demand for new money. So the money couldn't go to the government bonds. There were fewer companies that were considered low risk on the stock exchange, and the companies that were low risk were only growing moderately, because that's the result of being low risk. The only thing that was really growing really largely is the money they can put into real estate. And one of the things we saw before, public land is being used to ensure investors' profitability. We see that in the Brazilian example as well. A lot of that land in the port used to be public land, but it's used to ensure investors' profitability, market control. The land is no longer a fix for overaccumulation. It's used to mobilize and create leverage, as we saw in the Italian example, and then move the investment elsewhere. So land and real estate development become key, not just to the economy, but they also become key to municipal finance, to development, and a lot of it happens not on the balance sheet of the government, but off balance sheet. I didn't discuss that in detail, so you just have to kind of believe me for that. And then the last slide, in a way, a second kind of conclusion, but phrased differently. Land and real estate, as I said before, are central to financialized capitalism. They are not just another asset. They are the key asset to be financialized. All these practices are enabled through state actors. Securitization, this reselling of mortgages is, these real estate investment trusts are, all these urban projects, whether they are in Romania, in Milan, or in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, they're all involved the local government and often also higher levels of government in some way. They're often funded through a lot of debt, not just through investments from pension funds, but also through a lot of debt. And this is a little bit like a political drug. Just like the fix of David Harvey, that is a little bit like something that gets you high. This is a political drug also. It's not just an economic drug, it's also a political drug. It's highly addictive because it allows your economy to grow relatively fast, even when there's not a lot of money. But it's only a temporary solution. It also only temporarily allows elites to overcome these contradictions of capitalism, and then they create a new one. What we see that sometimes, some of these investments move, they go somewhere else, and we see that there's always new countries opening up. We can see that in the frontier that was very clearly discussed for the mall developments in Romania. We see that in Brazil, we see that in other ways, new countries, new cities, new developments are opening up. Of course, the alternative I could discuss for even as much time as I discussed this would be the definancialization of real estate and of cities. It would require welfare, it would require equity planning, it would require commoning. But I think first, there's a lot of discussions about this without fully understanding how actually this urban financialization takes place. So I think we need to understand that very well, and I hope the book will help to make that clearer also how that happens in Romania. Before we can really see where the solutions could come from. Thank you very much. And my apologies for speaking for so long. But Jock said you can make it longer and longer. Don't remove too many slides.
When you say those, we will show us a movie.
The movies were the other day. I could have a movie of a bridge for 30 minutes where nothing happens. Yeah. You want that? Any questions, comments, doubts?
Do you know which European country have the biggest percentage of house ownership?
It's Romania is one of them. Hungary is one of the other ones. Some of the former Yugoslavian countries are among the highest.
So this issue, analysis around.
It's not so much in this part of the picture. I have another one where I focus exclusively on housing. But one thing is also that the home ownership rate in Romania, the official one, is not the existing one. It's home ownership, but a lot of those houses are also being sublet. So in fact, rental market is bigger in Romania than official statistics show. Rental market is bigger than the official statistics show. Yeah. That's what Romanian colleagues also tell me. Because in fact, not everyone owns. Especially in the cities, there's more renting than there is. But it makes a difference for sure. But what makes the bigger difference is that a lot of those people got the properties relatively cheaply and not necessarily through mortgages. But for the newer generations, it's either a mortgage or you have to rent. So in a way, what is changing is, you could say with a delay, it's smaller, but it will be difficult for newer generations still to acquire that housing. So the homeownership rates would either go down a bit more or the rental market would increase, probably a little bit of both.
Can I ask you first a technical question and then a political one?
Yes.
So the technical one, what kind of actors benefit the most from securitization? Is it the banks? Is it the investment funds, the REITs? Do you think that
For the securitization of mortgages, or
yeah.
well, typically not the REITs because they wouldn't invest in securitized mortgages. So who benefits? I don't know. It's hard to say who benefits the most. I mean, the reason that it worked for some years is because different parties thought they benefited. People who promote securitization would say that it brings down mortgage interest rates, so that would benefit households. There's some evidence for the US that suggests that's the case, because it means more capital comes into the mortgage market, so it's easier to get a loan, interest rate goes down. I would say if there's more money coming into the housing market, the prices go up. So yeah, people can borrow more, but then they need to borrow more because the housing prices go up. So I would say households are not necessarily benefiting. You could say the banks are benefiting because once they sell the mortgages, they can use the money for something else. So they benefit. I would say investors benefit because they always look for something to invest in. And securities are still considered, despite the crisis, relatively low risk. So they offer them an investment product that's relatively low risk. In their perception, it's not important if we think it's low risk or not. So they benefit. The states might benefit because many states want to promote home ownership. Securitization means more money is going into mortgages, so that could help enable home. a large part of the land in the port was doing it might be expropriate.
Start to cut the, I don't know, if to stop for the rent to increase.
I mean, that's a different discussion because in fact the rent have increased more since that policy than before.
What?
Yeah, they have increased more the rents.
So they didn't. So
Well, they introduced a cap that was mirroring on so try to stop the rent increases, but had the effect of more increases.
Germans have more, in many cities, they ask developer to, they say, build, when they build something to have 30%, they say, for social homes.
Yeah,
Which in Romania is considered.
but most of the investment
in
funds.
Romania is considered communism.
Yeah, but this is a kind of different question because the investment funds buy up almost exclusively existing housing. So that's in Germany. Did you ask your political question yet?
Yeah, the space, the maneuvering space for local governments, national
Yeah.
states, according to their position in the global hierarchy.
Yes,
So,
which also shows that in Brazil it's happening only in the biggest cities.
yeah.
And even though in Sao Paulo the federal government was not heavily involved, the fact that in Rio they were meant there was a push for them to push these kinds of policies. People in Chile, middle-class people in Chile have pension funds. But now people in Brazil do too. And it's partly thanks to this policy. That's some of the ironies of it.
So this is also happening in China? Is that?
In China, something else happens, and there's a lot of research on this in China, but a lot of it is on the land development side. But which for many Brazilian real estate development is sort of like the experimental case. The experiments don't start in Shanghai or Beijing, they start in Chongqing. If they're successful in Chongqing, other cities take them on. So Chongqing has a similar thing which is called DPL, which is not structured the same way in Brazil, but it has a very similar result where you can do extra development and extra money flows in. And they also roll it out now to other cities. It's a different system. It's an entirely different system, and there's no evidence that Brazil or China copied each other, but around the same time, they introduced a very similar policy. And both of them are influenced by the US, and they changed, they changed the US policy in the same direction, into a financial product away from a negotiation. And we haven't found any evidence, because I had the Brazilians and the Chinese also talk to each other to find out if there's any way that they learned from each other, their governments, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that.
They did this mainly because they couldn't collect taxes?
In Brazil, that's the main reason. In China, one main reason is that the governments got less and less money from the federal government.
I don't think China. I don't think in China the land is owned by
The what?
I don't think in China most of the land is owned by the state.
It is. The urban land is owned by the state. The urban land is owned by the state, so therefore the state, the local government, often the only thing they can do is redevelop the land. Because the government barely gets any taxes from the federal level to the city level. So for the cities to actually be able to have their own policies, they need to redevelop the land. Rural land is typically not owned by the state, but urban land is mostly owned by the state, and often by the local government. So they need to use that land to make up for the fact that they get less and less money from the federal government to do more and more. A trend we see in many European countries also, where local governments need to do more with decentralization of policies and get less money from the federal government to do it. No, they don't have much land, but they are faced with a similar problem where they get less money from the federal government and have to do more policies. The decentralization of policies forces them to innovate, but since they don't have land, they do it in other ways, and which is often privatization. So there's a different response you find in Europe.
The local economy in Romania is the worst in Europe. The local authority in Romania is one of the worst in Europe.
Could be.
They do nothing without the central government.
They can compete.
Yes.
But speaking of that and what Yunus was asking, so can you get a similar effect in Brazil as you got in Milan because of those who buy the tips don't develop? They just sell them and sell them and resell them? But
In practice, that didn't happen much. Most of them weren't even traded much. The main thing that happened in Rio, that this federal fund bought them and then forced the developers into a partnership with them, and thereby became a main developer themselves. But they bought them up before the developers could buy them. And then they didn't want to sell to developers. They say, if you want to develop the land, we own the land and we own the financial rights to develop more land. So you have to work with us. It's the only way possible. And the developers were very eager, of course, to develop more because that's what they do. So yeah, the developers gave in. Also, there was only one fund. There were many developers. So the fund could choose, the developers couldn't choose. So they did a complete power play. But this fund is run without tax money. That's the other interesting way. So it's a completely self-funded, they own land, they run a bank, they do a lot of other things to make money, but they don't get tax money. Already you had a question for a while.
Yeah. Thank you, Manuel. It was super nice presentation.
Good.
I thought really beautiful, so it makes me...
But for too long.
No, it was beautiful. It's super difficult to ask a question in this context, but I'll try.
Yeah.
So I saw these graphs. This, if you remember, it sparked my attention previously in the online conversation we had. So there were these graphs showing that the total wealth is growing and that the manufacturing is declining and that the real estate value is growing and also that the employment is declining. And my question is because this contradicts one basic assumption assumption of Marxist like theory,
Okay.
which is that the surplus value comes as a result of the workers' employment. And my question is, where is this value coming from? Because it's obvious that it grows, but you don't. I mean, I try to imagine a bit, but it's difficult.
I would say a large part of it is not value in the Marxist sense. It's prices that go up. But to a Marxist, that wouldn't be value. The value would be in the labor time invested in it, right? The labor and the materials. So real estate needs labor and materials, but the large part of the price increase in real estate cannot be explained through labor or the materials. The materials become more expensive, labor also, but most of the increase in the price is not an increase in value. Only partially it's an increase in value. So I think it's that idea that it needs to be value, because economically we speak of it in value, but in Marxist terms, a lot of it isn't value.
So what's on those graphs is actually not exchange value, but
it is exchange value, but it's not value in the general sense of how Marx is. Because usually if Marx talks about value, he doesn't mean exchange value, right? He means value created through labor and through the materials you invest. And I think that's often the misunderstanding, that because economists and investors speak of that as value creation, but in Marxist terms that's not value creation. That's price increases. Or a Keynesian would say price inflation, which I think is even more confusing. Because price inflation just means price increase. Does it answer the question?
Yeah. In Romanian, the word for value just doesn't make any sense. But valoare, which is value, has also the meaning of price.
Yes, in many countries, I think, in many places, like, yeah. And sometimes it has also the meaning of moral values, right? So then then you start attaching them to economic values, because they have the same word. So I think that's a common misunderstanding. And then, in a way, when you analyze them, the one meaning is the meaning of mainstream economics, the other one is the one of Marxist economics, the third one is the one of ethics. So, and then they all become blurred because it's all the same word. That makes it worse, I think. Just like the word rent in economic theory meaning something else than what we mean in daily language with rent. So yeah, I can't solve that, unfortunately. Maybe next time? Then I need even more time. Okay. I think it's time to get some fresh air, some liquids.
Do you
No?
see the Brazilian model as something that might be reproduced or presented as a model?
I think
Contemporary capitalism.
I think the left one here is amazing. I think this is really like using capitalism in the right way. I'm skeptical of an alternative to capitalism because I don't think we really have it right now. But if you want to look for a better way to do capitalism, I think the left way here is one ingredient of it. If we can't have an alternative non-capitalist system, maybe we can, but that's a different discussion. Let's assume for now it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult definitely to do it through a democratic majority, so it would have to be a different kind of revolution. So if for the time being we're stuck with capitalism, if we can do it like on the left here, I think that's great. I think that's within capitalism a very good alternative, yeah?
Personally, I think that there is one detail which is missing from this picture, which is sustainability. I mean, this could be from an economic point of view a model,
Yeah.
but from a sustainable point of view,
It's not. No, that's why it's just one ingredient. But yeah, if you would have a no-growth policy, that would be very interesting. Yeah, then it would be very difficult to do this as well. I think that might be feasible for richer countries. Japan basically has zero growth, is still doing quite well. It's not a poor country, even though their growth is almost flat. So for Japan that may work, for Western Europe that may work, for the US, I don't think politically that's feasible, but they could do with no growth. But I think Romania is already a little bit different. Brazil is very different. If you would do no growth in Brazil, you basically doom a lot of people. So I think in Brazil, you would need some growth, and if you have growth and do it in the left way, would not be the worst.
Do you know if there is any European city looking seriously into this?
There's lots of local governments who do things like you mentioned, like 30% social housing within new developments, which is a great way to do it. That's the standard way in the Netherlands.
I don't think about it. I don't know. It's really work.
There's also, you can take revenues. I'm trying to think what the name of it is again. In planning, that's discussed a lot. The policy basically to take revenue
And
as a
in
government.
Europe we collect taxes, not in Romania, but we collect taxes.
Well, tax is one thing, but there's through the development itself, you can have a specific way of taxing it rather than just real estate taxes on the new developments, where you have you basically get the tax on the land's value increasing, not on the redevelopment after it has increased, but already on the moment that it increases, and that's possible to do, but it's hard to do that, and most places there's no political will. So there's cities who experiment with this. But to roll that out at a larger way is, I think, technically very well possible, but politically it's more difficult. And some cities trying to do it, but in some countries the national government wouldn't allow it. So that's another thing. So some of these experiments work better in the US because the municipalities have relatively more autonomy than in many European countries.
In Romania, you cannot even put a traffic camera on without asking the government.
Yeah, so then it would be difficult in Romania unless the national government would introduce it, which politically probably wouldn't happen. So
Probably one of the centralistic, I don't know what's correct, centralistic country in Europe.
yeah.
The government controls.
Yeah, so unless they want to change it, then, like in the Netherlands, it's very centralistic as well, and they have, in terms of social housing requirements, it's very clearly organized because the national government requires it to do it.
Romania is very decentralized budgets and I don't agree.
Romania?
Yeah, I don't agree, but that's a different discussion.
Budget?
We talk in the
Do you know
makes no sense.
do you know
Discuss.
what taxes collects the local government?
Afterwards.
No, I want to know.
Time to get some fresh air, maybe some liquids. Perhaps. I didn't want to say it because I don't know what's there.